Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to Indaba Africa. This is Chris coming to you from central Pennsylvania. My special guest today on Saturday is retired Major General Johan Jooste, who's to the side here on the screen. You can see him already. I brought him on. I'll have him come in just a moment. But Major General Jooste is a retired South African military officer. He joined the South African Defense Force, served as an infantry officer, later was part of the transition to the South African National Defense Force, and eventually retired as a Major General after his service. Later, he went into the private sector, working for BAE and traveling the world, experiencing quite a few things, and that should be interesting. And after that, worked for the South African Park Service for a number of years, and now works for the Peace Park Foundation, a non-governmental organization. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Dumela Botswana, Otsehelijang. Sawubona, South Africa, Goeiedag. And let me welcome in my guests today. We're going to talk about wildlife conservation and conservation in general across Africa. And who better to talk about it than somebody that knows the bush, that knows Africa, and has been devoting his entire life to service with others. So, Major General Jooste, goeiedag, hoe gaan dit?
Hi, Chris. Good to see you a distance away, but here we are. Goeiedag.
All right, excellent. Well, of course, you know, I always mess up my G's and Afrikaans, and my subscribers give me a hard time about it. Even when I get it right, I think they just have a crack and have a go at me, but that's quite all right. I do my best.
As long as we communicate, I've said to you earlier when we had contact, we will conduct this in the most spoken language on the planet, bad English.
Exactly.
As South Africans, we speak a harsh English, some of us, and it's a second language, but a universal language. So good to go, able and willing.
No, I think we're good set. You know, it's funny because when it comes to accents in English, people talk about what's the most beautiful accents that people, when they speak English, have. And the most interesting accents for me actually surprise some people, because I think the best accent that I've ever heard, of course, is the Irish lilt. When you hear the Irish speak, I just love the way that they speak. It's really beautiful. But then after that, which surprised a lot of people, I love Afrikaans, first language, South Africans, when they speak English. I love the sound of it. It's really awesome. So, but a lot of people are surprised. They're like, what? You think Afrikaners sound good when they speak English? Yeah, I think it sounds amazing.
No, we'll make it work.
All right, so let's continue with our bad English between the two of us. We'll sort it out here. So are you from the Northern Cape originally, or have I got that wrong?
Yes, indeed. I'm from the northwestern part of our country, the desert part. I always say that is what is right about me. It's not bad about me. But yes, a remote, a harsh country, and no doubt, living in the rural area there, growing up there, when I left school, there were a lot of things I didn't know. When I got to university, there were a lot of things I didn't know. But funny enough, I could catch up a lot of what I didn't know. And I found, with due respect, that many people couldn't catch up with the realities and the wisdom and the closeness to nature of what I've learned all my childhood.
So that was a question I wanted to ask you. So did you grow up on a cattle post or a farm of some sort?
I grew up in a mining community. My dad worked on the diamond mines. Remember, our minerals, the good Lord has placed them out inland, not on the waterways, on the oceans. Towards that way, a lot of minerals, and to this day, there are viable mines there. A little mining community way out of the main line.
So when you were growing up as a kid, did you work as a teenager or as a youth or something like that? I lived for part of my youth on a farm, and so I learned the value of hard work and the respect for work, and so that was kind of a big part of my maturation. Did you have a similar sort of experience?
Not really, Chris. Remember, we had to go to boarding school when you go to secondary school. So getting home, holidays was really getting home and reconsolidating. And I came from a workers' class family, to which family was important. So you would be around the house, and my late dad would never hire anybody to do the garden, for instance, and a lot of other around the house tasks. And that is what you did, and being together, and in a way rest from academy, rest from the school calendar and the school program. So even though I come from a working class family, I never worked holidays. It was those few weeks were spent at home.
Well, that's interesting because I loathe summertime. Kids in America look forward to summertime because they go swimming, they go camping, they hang out, they're free from school. And for me, it just meant more work, baling hay, cleaning the fields, things like that. So I didn't mind the work, but there were no big summer holidays for me. So I guess it's good that you got to experience that as a child. Once you finished, you say you went to university. What did you study at university?
I went straight from school into the military system. At that time, it was, like they say, seamless. You could apply for the military, be drafted into the military, and then if you were selected, go permanent force and go study at our military academy, the faculty at the University of Stellenbosch. And that is the way I took. So straight into officers training or basic training, then officers training. Studied a BCom or a commerce degree of all at the military academy, which normally was meant more for the guys that would go into HR or finance, although I later selected an infantry career. And yes, it was a huge benefit. It was a huge experience. It was, in a little way, life-changing for a youngster, being exposed on that level, and then on into the defense force, the permanent force.
So one of the things that is often misunderstood by people, and I've never been an infantryman, but of course I've been trained in infantry tactics and done exercise and such as an infantryman, but not as a vocationist especially. But one of the things people often assume is that infantrymen are, you take your not so bright people and put them there, and it's quite the contrary. In fact, the infantrymen are quite intelligent, quite bright. It takes a lot of skill to be able to be successful, to be an infantryman. Would you agree with my assessment?
I would, of course, agree. I was privileged over the next 15 or 20 years to command light infantry, motorized infantry, mechanized infantry, and in combat groupings, parachute infantry. And I'm a qualified paratrooper myself. And one had the privilege to train thousands of people, to command in operational conditions. I'm a war veteran, and an infantry career just brings you to realities. It's about people. Yes, you have technology, you have equipment, you have doctrine, but it starts on a parade ground. It goes onto a route march. It ends up in planning cycles, and ultimately it ends up where you are there with your men, as scared as any one of them. And that's an experience that is unique. That is something people today pay for 1,000 rands to go whitewater rafting or pushing the envelope. One had the privilege to live a life pushing the envelope. And one made a lot of mistakes, but one was always mindful of setting the example. So yes, to me as a person, it meant a lot to be allowed to be an infantry officer. And people ask the highlights. There's only one highlight. When you know, and you know it, when your appointment is validated in the hearts of your men. That's the only real reward when you serve in the military. I think elsewhere as well. So that was unique. And to this day, it inspires me.
I'd have to agree with you, and it's one of those things that a lot of people don't truly appreciate when they see that that a lot of military veterans are usually in high demand by corporations in the corporate world, and that's because military folks bring discipline, honor, responsibility, teamwork. These are all things you have to have. You can't survive in uniform, in peacetime or in conflict if you don't have that. And I think a lot of people really miss the point about the military. It's a team, and you have to have a team. And that team has to function together. If you can't work as a team, then you're going to fail.
I concur. Not because I was ex-military. My 35 years in the Defence Force, it was an amazing race. One was privileged. And also what it did to me as a person going the first quarter of a century, old South Africa, our infamous, or whatever, Bush War, and then the last decade in the middle of transformation, right in the middle of it, forging a new defense force that had to be different, but had to be applicable, had to be relevant, had to be legitimate. What I learned there made lasting impressions on me. And contrary to people thinking that the military are set in their ways and you wouldn't accept anything else and it's right or wrong, we learned there how to forge the new teams that you spoke about, how to have a defense force that is accepted by this country, that can meet the new challenges of peacekeeping operations primarily, and homeland defense. It was with great satisfaction that one was allowed to serve in the Army for 35 years.
No, and I don't want to spend too much time talking about the transition, but just briefly, I think it's important for people to understand the challenge that the SADF and then the SANDF faced. It's often overlooked, and so I just thought to mention, and if you'd like to comment it, please do. But people often don't realize now, we're not commenting on the South African National Defense Force today or yesterday, but back in 1994 when this transition took place. And the point is that the new force had to combine 7 different forces. You had to take the forces from the Bantustans, from Bophuthatswana, from the Transkei Defense Force, from the Ciskei, merge it along with Mkhonto we Sizwe and other groups into a single force. And overnight, the South African National Defense Force, or South African Defense Force, went from about 60,000 to 178, I think it was, or something like that, overnight. And then, of course, you had to sort out who stays, who goes, promotions, what happens, how to advance people. It must have been an incredibly difficult, I don't want to say traumatic, it wasn't traumatic, but it had to be a very difficult time to make this transition successfully.
It's a told story, but also an untold story of how us as an officers' corps of all these forces realized we had to make this work. How we took a basic stance to say we try and remain apolitical, we maintain standards, and then importantly, we don't negotiate, we do joint planning. Those 3 things, and the Chief of the Defense Force at that stage put that forward, and that was accepted. And how we could get through it. You're right, it sounds petty to somebody. What about medals? And what about recognition of prior service? And what about the pension fund? But primarily, decisions were made. Yes, the language was English. What if another language was chosen? At what disadvantage would I have been then with my Centurion English? What if we chose not to be a conventional army? Well, there's nothing wrong to be an unconventional army, but those were the sober choices that were taken by very brave people from the various forces. And there's a lot of criticism. Arguably, one could say that here and there things were sacrificed, but that we have a South African National Defense Force present in Africa in a number of countries at any one time, serving the homeland defense. I think it's not to be underestimated. We mustn't gloss over it lightly. It is the commitment of many people and good leadership that has made that possible to where we are today.
No, I think that's a very good point, sir. While I wouldn't say often, but I have at times been a critic of SANDF for its performance, I've also praised them for their good performances in places where they've done a great job, like in Burundi and other locations. But I think, as you've just mentioned, and I alluded to earlier, is that people don't really appreciate the challenge of this. Now, having been responsible for rebuilding an armed forces from the ashes of a civil war in Liberia, I have a deep appreciation for what is involved, what it entails, simple things like, just rank insignia and time and grade and
Yes.
building a structure so that people have life experiences in uniform so they can develop as leaders and develop their skills. And people just don't appreciate the complexity of that. And I think that, Hollywood loves making a movie about the Springboks and the 95 World Cup. And I'm grateful for that, being a Springbok fan. But maybe Hollywood needs to sit around someday and make a movie about the transformation of the Defense Force in South Africa.
Chris, at the risk of being anecdotal, I was a colonel then in those days. I commanded the leadership training unit of the South African Army. I was tasked to present an induction course for all newly appointed colonels and brigadiers. So 8-9 courses of 40 each, I did that. On one of those courses was the later Chief of the Army, General Romano, whose deputy I became. On one of those courses was the minister's wife, who later also became a 2-star general. What we lived through there, getting to know each other, is a story on its own that I'll not go into now. So just those experiences, to listen to each other then, take those first courses were so difficult. Things were so strained in the country. And it eased up and we could make the difference and we could build the mutual trust. And nobody is saying, I'm not so naive to say it was all glossy and and easy. That's not the point. Life is not like that.
No.
We got through it, and we'll get through other challenges as well.
No, I appreciate the positive attitude. I agree with that. The world's facing many challenges now, but we will get through it. One way or another, we'll get through it. So, I often joke with people because in the Armed Forces of Liberia, when I took over that responsibility in 2007, the senior officer in that force was a second lieutenant who I was training. We had 9 second lieutenants. Since then, that second lieutenant became a 2-star general and is now retired and become the defense minister, and the other officers become another 2-star and a 1-star and another 1-star. So when I see them, because I do see them, I always joke with them when I'm in Liberia, and I say, well, I have to be honest. I think I joined the wrong army. Here I am, a colonel, retiring at 36 years, and you guys are 2-star generals. I joined the wrong army.
One has to be philosophical about it also.
Absolutely. No, it's making full colonel is a great sign of success. I think a lot of people don't appreciate that. A couple of years ago, a student of mine at the War College here in Carlisle from Tunisia said, Colonel Wyatt, can I ask you a question? And I said, sure, what's up? He said, you know so much about Africa and you've had all these experiences. Why are you just a colonel? To which I kind of smiled and I said, just a colonel. When I came on active duty, there were 8,900 of us in 1989 as a lieutenant. Today, there's 140 of us left who are colonels or generals. It's not just a colonel. It's quite a long road, and you can appreciate that, sir.
Indeed.
Yeah. But the time does come that eventually we have to take our boots off and hang up our fatigues in the closet and our dress parade uniform and move on to something else. So eventually you did, retired after 35 years as a major general, and you moved on to the private sector. What was that like, the transition? Because someone asked me that last night. I did a after midnight, Happy Birthday America thing. I came on, did a stream, and people said, what was your transition like? For me, it's only been about 8 months, but going from being a lifelong soldier and a leader into the private sector, what was that transition like for you?
It was another journey, Chris. It was a decision that I took. And in the military, we say there's a principle. If you make a break, you make a clean break. No matter what. If you decide to stop playing rugby, if you decide to do something new, if you decide to enter a relationship, hopefully not. If you decide to start a new business, you make a clean break and you do that. It was not difficult. One had the fulfillment of 35 years of service. And I went into the military vehicle industry. And the best part of 7 years, I worked for an American company. And I could relate the world over, from Canada, US, Brazil, right through Europe, Sweden, Poland, through into Singapore, Taiwan, to military leadership, and understand the requirements, analyze that, and convey that coupled to new technologies to the company that I work for in South Africa. One had to reinvent oneself. There must be no doubt about it. Let's not be naive. If you don't take your pips off your pajamas, you won't be successful. You will later, because you're older and grayer, be respected, and maybe the odd mention of the general in the boardroom. That's not the point. Take your pips off your pajamas, get your BlackBerry or whatever and your laptop and start working. And there's a terrible experience. The first day after being a general, you get into the back of your car and the thing doesn't move. And you've got to do a presentation somewhere, so you look around, who will do this PowerPoint? My friend, you do it yourself. And it was a nice experience. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And it was another part of my journey. And I was again allowed to make a difference in a multinational company. Initially, our head office was in Houston, later in DC. So I traveled there often, and we had representation in 29 countries. So wherever one went, one could really get access to the top brains in industry, but then the armed forces. And yes, you had to create business, but you could do it really understanding the real requirement, not telling generals or colonels what they want. It was a good challenge, and it was a good reset for me at that time.
It's interesting you say that you get in the car and it doesn't move. You got to hope you don't get in the back seat. That's the first key thing, right? Make sure you get in the front seat. You're accustomed to having a driver. No, I will say that in our Army, that sort of norm was there when I was a young enlisted soldier in the early part of the 1980s. But by the time I became an officer, we were doing away with all that. So we even did away with our officers clubs. We didn't even have that for a social function. So I never had a secretary. I never had I did have a driver in Africa a couple of times, but that was a safety issue, not because of a position or rank, but basically never had a driver and did all that myself. So for me, that part of the transition was seamless because I always had to plan my own travel. I always had to get my own plane tickets. I always had to pick my own bags up. So that was never a challenge. But I can imagine having been in the flag ranks that, not that it's rude, but it's like, wait a second, there's nobody here. It's just me. Okay, let me grab my duffel bag and move out.
I also appreciate your reference to entitlement. That is also we did away long ago. Nobody carried your bags. Nobody take your bags off the band at the airport, and that is something that I personally don't like, and I didn't allow it. I never traveled with my personal staff officer, to take notes on minutes or what you did that yourself. And I got through a few tough patches in my life over my 3 careers by simply setting the example.
I agree with
as a serving officer, and then also getting back corporate, getting back into the civilian life. Like I say, nothing counts. If set the example and don't try and be super about it, and accept that you learn. And what I enjoyed also, Chris, was mixing with young people most of my life. Millennials are hard to lead. They're demanding, and some of them, with due respect, has maybe forgotten how to really work. But I enjoy millennials. They really make things happen, and it was.
Oops, did I lose him? I think I might have lost the general. Yep, it looks like he may have frozen up. His Wi-Fi is not the most reliable so far, so I'll give him a moment to try to come back. Oh, there he is. No, that's already behind. So hopefully he'll come back here in just a moment. Sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen. It's a Wi-Fi issue on that end, and let me get him. It says he's fine, but I don't see him there. So yeah. Anyway, all right. So yeah, interesting. I do not see him. Anyway, okay, so I've stopped this video. Sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen. Hopefully the general will call back in just a moment. My apologies for that. It's a network connection problem there. Here he comes. He's coming back now. Excellent. So let me get him back in the meeting. There he is. There you are. Looks like we had a Wi-Fi. Looks like we had a Wi-Fi problem there.
Yes. It was it is my side. Sorry.
No, it's quite all right. So we were talking about millennials, and I was about to say, waiting for you to finish, that in some respects, not to be disrespectful or dismissive of millennials, but it's kind of like herding cats. They have a mind of their own, and they have their own plan.
I always say to them, be accommodative. I'm not part of the gray backwash. I'm part of the gray tsunami. I have a lot to offer, and I accept what you can offer. Together, we'll make a hell of a team. Let's do it.
There you go. So you worked in this private sector for a while, but then eventually you found your way to the South African Park Service. And how did that come about? And was it a personal reason you went to it, or just a job opportunity, or so? Because I mean, obviously you serve in uniform because you have a sense of mission, a sense of purpose. And I'm going to guess that working in the parks, you probably have to have that too. But I don't know because I never worked for the parks.
Chris, yes, when I turned 60, I exited. I had to exit from the company that I worked for, and fortunately, I had some options, and my preference was to go do research, and I had an option lined up in that direction. And then it's a long story, but by coincidence, at a lunch, a person asked me what I was going to do, and said, but I think I have something. So in our country, all over the world also, when you're 60, when you're Caucasian and so on, it's not as if you have a lot of opportunities. And he mentioned to me, and he asked my CV the next day, can I splash your CV? Will you do a briefing? And yes, I was headhunted by the South African National Park, by the then CEO, Dr. Mabunda, with the permission of the board and the Department of Environmental Affairs. And initially, it was thought that the Rhino crisis brought this about, wildlife crime and corruption. And initially, the thinking was that I become a consultant and that I'd work from head office And this evolved within 3 short weeks to where he said to me, you go to Kruger, you go take over the Ranger Corps of Kruger, write down, dust on your boots, tactical level, which was a very good thing. And I was just, and I am so grateful for that opportunity, because now I know. And now going forward, being more consultative, being on a higher level in our department, now I know what is happening. That 3 years in Kruger brought me straight into that. It is arguably not the best of choices when you're 60 and you're parachuted into that environment, but it served me well. One was allowed to, and one could make a huge difference to the tyranny of rhino poaching and wildlife crime and corruption.
No, it's quite a sad tragedy. I'm a huge fan of rhinoceros. It's sad to see what's happened to the white and black rhino populations. There had been some recovery of some rhino herds, but the poaching seems to just continue unabated, despite the best efforts. Fighting that in Kruger, I imagine that's quite a big challenge. You probably have to deal with transnational crime networks, also local folks who are just trying to make a surviving and that sort of thing. Is that what was the biggest challenge when you dealt with that particular issue of rhino poaching?
Chris, yes, let's take just one step back.
Okay.
You know, we could, the way we could in this year South Africa drive that crime down it's almost not acknowledged. We started, we're a decade into this rhino poaching scourge. We started the decade with about 22,000 rhino, white rhino.
Mm-hmm.
We currently have between 16 and 17. We lost about 10,000.
Wow.
But through good breeding, through good biodiversity management, and through digging our heels, we are where we are. Mischievous people say, it's because you have fewer rhino, you lose fewer. That's a factor, but not a determining factor. I can take you province by province to the country through what we've done in Kruger, and one can look at the statistics, and yes, we could arrest this and drive it down from levels unmanageable to levels currently, it's not victory, it's success. When I landed up in the park, it was down to basics. If it was only down to basics, it would have been easy. My only brief was paramilitarize the rangers and consolidate them. And I soon realized that it was fall out in 12 huge projects. They were first the state of the rangers. Even before I retrained them, and forgive the I message, and even before we re-equipped them, and even before we did all the interventions, one had to look at the basics of uniform, the basic equipment. So right down there. Now, while doing that, there's this media. While doing that, there's the politicians. This was a huge embarrassment for South Africa. While you're doing that, it's Mozambique. It's your other neighbors. It's technology. It's industry. And that there is where I was an older person, but where wisdom helped and more maturity, because heaven knows I had to design a concept of operations and implement the thing. And I just started by basically saying, think big, start small, act now. Think big, start small, act now. You had to act. They were killing 3 rhino a day in Kruger.
Wow.
There were up to a dozen incursions at a time. At that time, the Mozambique border was very hostile. You've got to start small. You have to implement things, and you've got to think big, because the strategic solutions lie with demand reduction or management and community ownership. And that is behavioral change that takes time. Just one example, if I may also, at that time, this country was livid. The broad nation and the public said shoot to kill. And they wanted the general to do that. And they said hot pursuit operations into Mozambique, they wanted. And they said, let's fence them out. Let's build a Berlin Wall. None of those 3 was ever any option with us. I can assure you. But we started working in Mozambique under extremely different conditions. In 2013, 75 to 80% of poaching occurred from Mozambique. By end of 2015, we had it down to under 40%, just over 30%. It can be done. with all the various parties in that country, despite all the imperfections, which despite politics and other challenges, it can be done. So to answer your point, I started with people, rangers. Technology makes things possible, only people make it happen. So there you were going right almost to your company commander, platoon commander days, because we had to reconsolidate the rangers, build the morale, get pride, get them mission ready as a paramilitary force. And let me also emphasize, paramilitary. Military operates in sections and platoons and companies, battalions. We never did that. Yes, paramilitary because of the threat you faced. I always use the example, if you go to Europe now, the police look a lot different than a decade ago. Similarly, one had to make sure that you give your rangers the best chance of being successful and protecting them. So it started with people and rangers who, and I'm being dramatic now, had to look at this retired general and he's telling them we're going military and you take them along, and before that, the command and control was not there, the discipline was not up to standard, the equipment, the logistics. And again, what pulled one through was example. Be right there and be absolutely transparent. Whether you talk to the politicians, the media, your own people or industry, be absolutely transparent.
No, I'd have to say that I agree with you. When it comes to leadership, your credibility is your actions and your deeds and how you deal with people. So I'm often reminded of Lieutenant Colonel Paul Leto van Voorbeek, who was the head of the Schutztruppe in Tanganyika in German East Africa, and how for 4 years he eluded the entire Commonwealth forces, including young Christian Smuts, and they never surrendered. And he was beloved by his African troops, the Askari, and by the Germans who were in his force, not because he was a great military mind, although he was a pretty good guerrilla leader. He certainly understood the role. But he was beloved because he set the personal example. When his troops went without, he went without. When it was time to move out, he was up and moving. When it was time to sacrifice something, he sacrificed, and he led by example. And I think that's kind of what you're getting at there, is you have to be present to be a leader, and you have to set the right example. Otherwise, people really don't know what to follow.
And you protect them, Chris.
No.
You protect them from political influence. There was severe political influence, always well meant, and we must maybe get to that. People say there's not political will in South Africa. There is indeed. You must protect them from the media. You must protect them from the neighbors. You must protect them from social media. That's your work. That you do yourself with your core team. You never allow that to rub off on your subordinates. Not at that time, when we were converting our Ranger Corps into anti-poaching units and importing new methods, new methodologies, new doctrine, new technology. It was a serious 3 years of building arguably the best anti-poaching unit on the continent.
Well, that's saying something, because you've had a long history of anti-poaching operations taking place in Kenya, and you've also had the Botswana Defense Force now that has decades of experience using the military for anti-poaching. So saying something you had the best unit in Kruger is quite impressive. But I'm imagining that you really had to approach this from a holistic perspective, as you've kind of alluded to. First off, you've got to look at your Rangers. You've got to make sure they're fit. You've got to make sure that they're mentally, physically fit for the task in hand and understand what it is. You've got to make them feel like they're part of a team. You've got to organize them. And then from there, once you build that team and improve that team, you've got to take care of their personal safety. You've got to train them appropriately so they know how to deal with situations, equip them properly, communications so that they're not at risk. And all of that comes together. And then eventually I imagine that intelligence also plays a role here. You need some intelligence to help out your Rangers to be in the right place at the right time. It has to be an all-encompassing challenge, I would imagine, to pull this off.
Absolutely. And you had to do it concurrently. You had to be disciplined to believe in what you're implementing without now being inflexible. You couldn't hesitate. But concurrently take care of expectations, the public expectations, the political developments, political leadership demands, the complexity of the relationship with Mozambique, and believe in the basics of what we did with the Ranger Corps, the air wing, the special rangers, and the canine wing, because we had to establish those and mold them together in a single team. And to your point of intelligence, we had to double up the effort on environmental crime investigations.
Yeah. So I'm sorry.
Then outside the park, you had to concurrently develop technologies. And there we were caught up between industry push and donor pull. Industry wants to sell, they PowerPoint you to bits, and you have donors who wants to give money for that. You have to manage it because you have to go technology. Technology is, I still believe the wow will be in Africa on technology. We had to zone Kruger, and we had to reach out to Mozambique, working with 7 different parties there. Concurrently, we have to communicate because the media were at us, and I'm proud to say that apart from the carte blanche story, we came out well with the media because we were consistently transparent. We never lied to the media, and even small way, never hid facts from them. And then we had to raise funds. There was not money for that. I was fortunate to mobilize 400 million South African rand. Now, I know there's not a lot of dollar, but it's still a lot of money over 4 or 5 years. And forgive the I message, but because one knew one's stuff and one could communicate and put forward a proposition, that was the sort of money that we brought into play there to work towards a transformation and an anti-poaching unit that could face up and still is facing up to an epicenter of the threat in Africa. There are other severe threats as well throughout the continent, whether it's abalone or elephant or cycads. But what has happened in Kruger and the intensity there is often underestimated. And I'm not making an overly dramatic statement.
No, I would have to agree based on my background and knowledge of what's going on there. But you touched on 2 points there that I think are important. Number one, you didn't have the luxury of sitting on the sidelines and going, okay, we have to develop a force, and this is the structure, this is the doctrine, this is the equipment. Let's prepare this and then field it. You're building the airplane in flight is what you were doing, which is something similar I did in Liberia. In the midst of flight, you were adding wings and changing ailerons to this operation. That's quite a big challenge, wouldn't you say?
You're summarizing it well. If I could convey without now likening the likes of Jooste or exaggerating or dramatizing, it was urgent and intense. It was the greatest challenge of my life. Exiting as the deputy chief of the army, later become a director in a multinational company. This was something that I've never experienced. The multi-layer, the multifaceted, the pure brutal urgency of all. The number of times on one day that you send out the helicopters, the number of times you have to look at crime scenes, getting your police and your army on board, making sure that you do intelligence within your mandate, and then managing this multitude of projects that we had to handle, growing the air wing, the canine wing, the special rangers, and the environmental crime investigation. On a managerial level, it was taxing because you're inserting this in an environment that is not used to this. Kruger and the conservation world is the pace of seasons, of moons, of dry and wet, of rain. And other than that, it's the pace of tourism, which is shorts and slops. And here you come, everything you do is against the grain of that rhythm, that century of Kruger, and all of a sudden, this is the reality. And here is this grayish retired general pushing that. So at one stage, people thought I couldn't manage change. There was just sometimes, I know perfectly well the minutes of managing change, where you just went in and one had the courage and the boldness to demand certain things, mindful that you've got to make up for it tomorrow. One mustn't be silly. No, indeed, it was an intense and a very challenging time. And the result of it is simply this Ranger Corps, this anti-poaching unit that could drive down the poaching rate. And then, legacy, an anti-poaching unit with all the various wings that can stand the test of time. And the lessons learned there, we now rub off all over the country. That's what I'm doing now, under contract from the Peace Park Foundation, seconded to our department, getting this out to all our provinces, and as far as possible, integrating with our neighboring states on this matter.
So there's a part here that you mentioned that I'll just go into briefly before we move on, and that I think is a critically important part. And I learned this as a major and lieutenant colonel. Not that I was ignorant of it, but I certainly learned it up close and personal. And you've stated here a similar experience. And what I mean is that when I was thrown into the midst of the security sector reform in Liberia, rebuilding the armed forces of Liberia, suddenly I found myself as a major initially, and then as a lieutenant colonel shortly after that, in the midst of a very political process, a very political situation. And it wasn't just interagency within the government of Liberia. It was, of course, the U.S. government, because that's who I was there for. And it was the United Nations. And then it was the neighboring states. So you, in the midst of all of this work to build this team, to equip it, to prepare it, to protect it, to resource it, you're also dealing with, you alluded to, interagency, interdepartmental challenges within the South African government and then the neighboring states. Wow, I don't think many people really appreciate the complexity of that.
It's complex. If we start right within SANDF is a complex organization. It is huge. It's a one serious organization that I'm very proud of. So now you're part of this 22 national park, you're part of SANDF. And the nation then wanted to know, how can South African national park not stop this? And after a while, now you have this general, so he can also not stop this. You know, it took us 3 years to stabilize the situation. You have a board who are political appointees. You have a ministry. And I must always refer back to Minister Edmond Maleva, and the support chief personally gave me, the late Minister Edmond Maleva. The support and recognition she gave me, the difference she allowed me to make. Then you're into the political spectrum. You go to Parliament, to the Portfolio Committee, and they want to know why this embarrassment. So you cannot do it. You, from a SANDF, has to manage the relationship with your department. Then you take the other dimension within a security cluster. You're the retired general, so you're part of this task force, because it's a priority crime, that work with 7 branches of your police and the defense force and customs and revenue services. And now, because of this international dimension, you interface internationally with a neighboring state, with the complexity of stakeholders. And then the interface with the private reserves and the communities. The community is not your primary task. So I'm not trying to make it more complex than it is, just explaining. Mm-hmm. And one had to do that concurrently while flying from post to post, motivating rangers, visiting crime scenes, while managing projects. I mentioned a number of you, the money that we spent at that time concurrently. Yes, complex indeed. And I always said a complex problem doesn't require a complex solution. It requires an inclusive solution, a complicity solution almost. Don't make it more complex, but make it inclusive and make sure that you cover all bases best you can without trying to do everything, because here and there you'll fail. But at any one day almost, and at any one period, you have to decide, do you lean tactically now to get back to why the tactics are not working? Why don't we have intelligence? And the next day, you're in Parliament. And the next day, you face industry who want to sell stuff to you. And then later, you are in the US raising funds. And people want to know what you're achieving. And also the NGOs. I have the greatest of respect for NGOs. I work for an NGO. The NGO environment, complex and very taxing, and that was part of one's brief.
So speaking of NGOs, the NGO that you're working for, the Peace Park Foundation, has a focus, if I'm not mistaken, on conservation. And that's really what we're talking about here in many respects, is conservation. I always like to identify myself by having been a farmer and kind of an amateur forester, because I took care of the woods that we had in our property, and I had envisioned a life in forestry, but I decided to serve in uniform. But I've always envisioned described myself as a conservationist. I tell people that you don't take a tinkle in your backyard. You have to preserve your natural environment, use it, revitalize it, and be responsible. Because you have people you have environmentalists who are very radical and say that, we can't use any of the resources of the earth. We have to leave things alone, leave it untouched. And then you have others who just want to pillage and take every resource, saying it was put here for our use. And to me, a conservation is somebody that says you can use the resources we find around us, but you have to be responsible. And it seems like the Peace Park Foundation, unless I'm misspeaking, please correct me, is focused on conservation, and that's one of its big goals here. You and I talked before we went on air about some of the challenges, like timber being pilfered, abalone off the coast of South Africa, and also obviously rhino and elephant poaching for their horns. So if I kind of hit it on the mark, is that what the Peace Park Foundation is really about? Is about conservation?
Absolutely, and the transfrontier concept has meant so much to Africa. It has built bridges that otherwise would not have been built, given political differences, instability, and so on. I think that peace parks have been wise and prudent, always getting government permission. Peace Park Foundation will not move into a country unless it has full approval, and sometimes it takes long. They have a strong fundraising arm. They have trend-setting projects in Africa across boundaries, and I think they balance well. You know, on the one hand, you've got to look at the conservation pure. On the other hand, you've got to look at the communities and the broader society. And yes, remember, there are human rights groups also in this mix. I just think that Peace Parks manages this well. They're successful in mobilizing resources because they're credible. Look at the results. Go through Africa and look at the projects that are there. It's a wonderful legacy of the late Dr. Rupert, today Johan Rupert, and then the CEO, managing this so well. It has grown out of proportion almost. With due respect to the other NGOs, African Parks equally, WWF, Endangered Wildlife Trust, and the other few hundred NGOs that must find their place in this wide setting of mobilizing resources and managing effective projects. But Peace Park specifically, not because they pay my salary, because I've been involved with them 6 years. And in the dark days back in Kruger, 2030, they reached out and they said, we've got to get involved in this rhino scourge, in this crisis. And together we planned that. And we ended up managing projects together, doing fundraising together. And it has brought us, a big part of where we are today has brought us exactly to that cooperation and that close cooperation. Other NGOs as well, I must add.
You mentioned, of course, the rhino. We've talked a lot about the rhino issue here, but obviously that extends to elephants as well for their horns. But that's just one aspect of it here too. I mean, we're also talking about habitat preservation. We're also talking about reintroduction of species, perhaps in an area where they've been reduced or eliminated. And then in the context of Botswana and South Africa, one of the things I learned when I served there is that the Botswana Defense Force not only does anti-poaching operations in the Okavango Delta, in the northeast around Kasane National Park, because there's poachers prevalent in both places, but they also have to do operations along the southern border with South Africa. And people are like, well, what's that about? Well, there is a colored community that lives on both sides of the border, and they're related, the folks in Botswana and the folks in South Africa. And some of the folks from that community are involved in catching live animals in Botswana from the Trans-Kalahari National Park, but also anywhere along the border there, and then transshipping them out through South Africa to Asia for parks and for personal use for people in Asia. So that's yet another aspect. So habitat conservation, protecting the actual wildlife itself, and then also conservation of the natural environment. All of that plays a big role in this. That's essentially what it's all about, yes?
Africa holds the last caches of fauna and flora on the planet, specifically then fauna, the last caches of big mammals. There are none other. You know the globe as well as I do. It's heritage. It is natural heritage, and it's also the economic engine of Africa and of our country. If you take away tourism, if you take tourism out of the equation, after then long when the gold will be done and the diamonds and the platinum, it is the economic engine. So if the appeal of heritage is not strong enough, I think the economic engine should be additional to convince one to commit to this. The neighboring states, and specifically the Botswana model, is a totally different model. There, almost to an extent, the army is the primary executor. Mm-hmm. In our country, it has evolved to a point where we have an enforcement chief directorate within our Department of Environment, and we have a strong ranger corps with the national parks and also provincial parks as the main actors. It's partly because of the intensity and it's happening on our beat, and partly because of all the other obligations for the army and the police. And then frankly, anti-poaching operations has become specialized. The language of the bush is tracking.
Yeah.
If you cannot track, you're illiterate. I've seen crack soldiers, I've seen special forces, police task force, the best, not succeeding in the bush. If you cannot track, what will you do there, specifically in a big park? You will be all kitted up and geared up and motivated and trained, and then bushcraft, and that's what goes with it. Now, we've also trained our rangers in methods and techniques, but ultimately it comes down to live and thrive in the bush and to be able to track the language of the bush.
Well, when it comes to tracking and bush tradecraft, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone better than the San, the bushman. In fact, in Namibia, in Botswana, and also in South Africa in the past, bushman trackers have been key parts of military operations. Do they play a role in conservation as well?
Now, being anecdotal, I was the San Battalion commander in the Western Caprivi in Namibia in the middle 80s. So I know them very well. They've been translocated to South Africa. They are very good trackers, the best. It's just not as easy as picking up a few San people and placing them in a park. What about the culture and the families? And it's more complex than that, but we are having very successful experiment in our Kruger National Park, which is a rhino park. They've been deployed for a few years now with great success. And I am indirectly involved in a project in a city in the central part of South Africa, Kimberley, from where an ex-colonel, retired Colonel Skumbi, and his wife is trying to resettle them and continuously train them in batches of 10, 20, and 30. Because I think they have a role to play. They have a huge role to play. Just not do migrant labor. Just not go pick them up there and quickly come do this. Because if I settle them in an area, I'm going to make sure that there's longevity in terms of their persona, their family, and then the task they must do. Indeed, as trackers, the best in the world.
So before we get towards the end here, I did want to get a little bit of questions and comments in from the folks in the chat. So one of the things here earlier, Christophe Havanga mentioned the use of drones or unmanned air vehicles to do this. Now, you've talked about the importance of the human element, and you said the technology can help, but you have to have the reliable human element. But if you can respond to that question about the role of drones or UAVs for conservation, and not just for anti-poaching operations, but for conservation in general. Obviously, you can use it for aerial imagery and for sensing to look at water quality and sources and such. And another question, I'm not familiar, you may know about this aircraft, but I was in Pretoria a couple of years ago, and the former South African Air Force commander, General Rhino, I went with him up to Paramount, and I looked at this thing called the Arc Light. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's quite an impressive little aircraft. I think it's brilliant for this sort of activity. But what do you think about aviation and or drones for conservation?
One step back, please, Chris. You need sensors. Mm-hmm. You need sensors that can help you in the African bush. The bush is vast, and specifically Kruger, the size of Wales or the size of Israel. So you need force multipliers. The best sensors to date that we've implemented is radar. It's numero uno. Mm-hmm. And then to an extent magnetic, soil-mounted magnetic, but it's very expensive. That is so sensitive, if you throw a knife over it, you will see a signal on your screen. We've tested the whole range, acoustic, magnetic, optronic. Those two are the most effective. Now, drones has a place. My philosophy was always big park, big view. You've got to have something in the air. The sort of drone that will give you observation is not a small drone. It needs payload. It needs a couple of kilograms, and it needs power, and that is now a serious drone. It's still cheaper than a manned craft. A drone is more appropriate to manage your asset, to know where your rhino are, to monitor your rhino. And I firmly believe that soon we'll be able to do censuses with drones if you have the right sensors and filters. By the way, and I believe I believe satellites in 3-4 years will be affordable enough to do this. We'll change Africa with satellite. So drones were very overestimated at one time. I spoke about drone fever. I had to brief our minister, late Minister in her house once. I did a year's trial on drones, a full year, to cover all vegetation, all conditions, dust, rain, seasons, and to come to hard conclusions. And it was very Kruger focused. Now, Kruger is the average big reserve in South Africa is 50,000 hectares. That is 1/40th of Kruger. So let's not take Kruger. That was very specific. It's a very demanding environment. It's not the silver bullet. It has a place, but make sure that what you utilize it for, even if it has infrared on it, it won't just solve your problem. Even if you fly in a pattern, where do you fly in that big place tonight, and what pattern do you fly? But it specifically had a place. And then light aircraft like the Alec, we had it there and other there, it has a place. But it's not as if you fly the African bush and you see the poachers and you send your people. It has a place, it's part of your inventory, and it's not so much about the craft, it's about the sensors that are on that craft and how you fuse the information from that into your operation center.
No, I think that's important, and that's why you need a larger vehicle, because you want to put multi-sensors on there so that you can do multitasking on it, do different things, and not just be restricted to to a photo optical or IR. If you can do more on one platform. So that's, of course, we have a long history using those here in the U.S. military now, and I was engaged with the Pioneer development early on about 30 years ago. But so it's of interest to me too. Now, Sir Morton Christie made a comment here, which I think is an interesting one, and if you could respond to this. He now I don't know how close this is accurate on the figure, but I think it's relatively close. He says about 80% of South Africa's game is privately owned, not in state-owned parks, but on private ranches. When I think of places, not even places for hunting, but places like Madikwe in Northwest, which is a private reserve, that I believe that is the case. Is that in fact the case? Most of the game in South Africa is on private land and is managed by private owners, and if so, does that present a serious challenge for conservation, or does it help conservation?
I cannot comment on game or natural resources as a whole. What I can confirm is that more than half of the rhino of South Africa is in private possession and is managed and guarded and protected by private industry. And that is why in my current position, I'm working in a very focused and sober way to make sure that we look at rhino as a national. A rhino doesn't have a number plate. It cannot be private or provincial or national anymore. And more so, we must realize we've got to reach out to the private sector, because more and more owners exit the industry because it's become unaffordable. The cost of ownership is just too huge. Private ownership, I think, is a huge example. And I've been working in the provinces for 3 years now. So many places and so many times the private sector sets the tone. They lead. In some of the wildlife zones we are now organizing in South Africa, we're organizing 6 zones, mostly centered around key rhino populations. The private sector sets the tone. In 3 of them, the jock is even in a private reserve. I see it as a huge advantage. And if I may say, personally, I'm working very hard, and there's been a big advancement in our department to draw in the private sector. This must be an integrated effort. And I know it's a cliche, the integrated, coordinated effort. That's the only way we will prevail against wildlife crime and corruption and manage our resources well for the heritage part and the economic engine part of it.
Sir, your time is valuable. You've been very generous with your time so far, so I thank you for that. But a couple of very good questions just came in at the top of the hour. We're at 1 hour. Can you go a little bit longer, or do you have something else you need to attend to now?
No, let's do it.
Okay.
Let's do it, please.
All right, great. Then let me throw a few of these. First off, let me do a little housekeeping, folks. So if you're just tuning in, and some people just came into the stream, you're listening to Chris Wyatt Africa on the Indaba Africa channel. My guest today is retired Major General Johan Jooste, former South African Defense Force, South African National Defense Force officer, retired as a Major General. and then worked in private sector for a while, traveling the world in the defense industry. Eventually found himself working for the South African Parks, and now works for the Peace Park Foundation. And we're talking about conservation, and we talked a little bit about his upbringing, his life early in the discussion, but you're listening to this conversation now about conservation. And so I've got a couple of questions which people put in the chat, and one's a statement. So let me see, who was this that said this, because it got away from there. Ranger Jakes, sorry, I didn't recognize that username. Ranger Jakes says, Kruger's tar and dirt roads only gives you access to around 4% of the whole park. I think that's probably pretty accurate, that you can't really get to a lot of the park by road, so you have to do it through the bush. Is that accurate, sir?
That's a very important point about Kruger. Kruger is a beast. Like I say again, 2 million hectares, 20,000 square kilometers. It doesn't have infrastructure by design. So you don't have Wi-Fi. You don't have roads. You don't have landing strips. There are wilderness areas that often we thought, can we afford to have the wilderness areas? But we mustn't give up on it. We mustn't now unnecessarily build roads into wilderness areas that is untouched, that is pristine. So often we thought, shall we not get Wi-Fi to have better communication, which will cut two ways. So you are down in Kruger for 80% of it to rangers. You're down to air, and that means helicopters and bantam aircraft that can land on the road to give you the necessary mobility. And then, so important, you've got to focus in your park. You've got to do the protection, but discipline yourself to clear the park from the outside. It's like the layer of an onion. You've got to go to your boundary. You've got to go to your communities, into your country, into your neighboring reserve and your neighboring countries. But that exact point that is made there, that is why often people in industry don't understand. What is your problem? Let's put up a few sensors. The roundabout boundary of Kruger is 1,000 kilometers. So you climb over the fence. So we all know a fence won't keep you out. There are places where you make the fence intelligent. And then you've got to react. Now, how do you get there with this sort of road infrastructure? I never thought we would allow ultra-light vehicles to travel off-road, but we had to do that. The Polaris vehicle. Here and there, you had to give a little. But let's not get ahead of ourselves and now just build the infrastructure every time you look at the environmental impact and balance it out. Very valid point. That is what makes Kruger unique.
Well, let me, this is actually a nice compliment that came on. It was paid to you by Gus. He says that Mr. Jooste still has his head screwed on correctly. Thank you for your contributions. That was a very kind comment. Blues Pixie says, Chris, I did ecology and conservation at the University of Cape Town. My complaint is we've messed up most habitats. Animals are spread across the country now in cages called reserves. Huge chunks of each species diversity is decimated. I think there's a legitimate point there, is that when we have habitat loss and you have smaller and smaller habitat areas, there's a really important part to conservation. You have to make sure there's biodiversity in which you may have to relocate some animals from one park to another so that you can get diversity in the DNA and you don't get inbreeding, that sort of thing. Is that a huge challenge because of humans are everywhere?
It's a huge challenge. Indeed, I have to concur. And it's so good to stay on my farm, which is so big. I've introduced so-and-so. Now the department manages it well. But you end up, I won't say a cage, but a ranch that is just too small to do justice. And fortunately, more and more again, the private sector takes the lead. And more you get Bavarias. More and more there are areas where 4 or 5 game farms say, let's drop the fences. And that is heartening. But to constantly balance your income stream, do you have too many tourists? Do you want to be sexy and have interaction with so many animals, which is not really conservation with due respect? It's a balancing act of note. And that is why I mentioned in Kruger also. Where in the world do you find wilderness areas where for tens and tens of kilometers there's nothing? You cannot understand that even a human exists. Reserve that, and when you have a game ranch, when you have a game farm, when you have a private reserve, municipal or provincial reserve, strive towards good management and good biological management. Otherwise, in the long run, it will just catch up with you, and you'll have your genetic and DNA problems, and that's what goes with it.
You know, it's interesting. One of my favorite creatures is the elephant. And elephants, of course, are a matriarchal society, very intelligent creatures with long memories and really smart family units and groups. But I remember that because of the conflict in Angola for so long, what was happening there with seeing landmines being placed, you had UNITA operating in the southeast of the country. You used to have elephants for a long time that would transit between the Okavango in Botswana through Caprivi into Angola. But then because elephants were running across landmines and being injured, they adapted, they learned. And as a consequence, the herd stopped moving into Angola and then eventually stopped moving into Caprivi for the most part and stayed in Botswana. And one of the reasons why they've grown is the conservation and the use of the military in Botswana for anti-poaching, but also because they no longer ventured in Angola. It's amazing how clever wildlife can be when it faces a challenge that it has time to adapt to. You don't have time to adapt to idiots running around with AK-47 slaughtering elephants and rhinos if you're a rhino, but you can adapt to something like that. And animals are quite clever.
We are fortunate in Africa to still have expanses of wildlife, where some natural migration takes place. And again, I'm leaning back to Kruger. But even there, it's not natural migration. You have to intervene, and that interventions must be so calculated. And to create the havens, to create the refuges, where you at least keep out the almost industrial poaching, the levels of poaching. And again, back to Peace Park Foundation, to do this transfrontier, you have areas that you grow, to inside and with that areas, take communities along. We must believe in that as a strategic solution and keep doing it. As much as I would say, enforce the law, we all know we're buying time. This is not the end game. The end game is not the rangers and enforcing the law. Everyone knows, unfortunately, they have to be there. But pursue all the other aspects of biological management, of sound community interaction, and growing the estate, so to speak.
So Morton Christie asked, I think, a very good question here, and this is an interesting from a historical perspective, and I'm sure you'll be able to answer it, but you might have to parse your answer because politics might be involved. But Morton's question is, please ask the general why the Kruger anti-poaching unit was in such a sad state when he took over. Because then he says they were very good. I assume that they were very good at one point and degraded, and then they improved.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for understanding that one is careful now not to be the Messiah. The one problem was that in the park the rangers were part of conservation, but they resorted under the tourist regions, the 4 regions. Now that there's no unity of command. So who is in command now? And then from about 29 onwards, this threat just overtook everybody. Nobody could have foreseen that it will escalate to that level. And now you have incremental reaction. And now you have a logistics system not keeping up. Then you had the problem of appointing 100 extra rangers. And with due respect, behind that was not the planning that would mean that they would be housed and they will have a personal weapon and there will be enough vehicles and you will adjust your rank structure. So it was coming almost from an era where that was not so important, when rangers were still rangers doing 5 or 10% of law enforcement, slap bang into this threat. And I will always appreciate the boldness of Dr. Mabunda then to appoint this, let's say it, ex-apartheid era general, to say, no, you're not a consultant now, go do something about that. And I made many mistakes, but one could give the glue that put together a ranger corps that soon became very disciplined and very proud. One must never underestimate the sacrifices that were made. And the shock to that system, to be militarized overnight almost and become a paramilitary force, and how well they are doing today. So prior, one would never deny that prior good work was done. It was just not up to this sort of threat.
So there's a few more comments coming here, sir. One is Hendo says, I'm enjoying this live stream. Interesting, educational, all caps. But Hendo does have a habit of using all caps, so I'm not so sure if that was for emphasis or just standard operating procedure for Hendo. So thanks for that, Hendo. Now, Ranger Jakes, are you an actual Ranger? That's not like a Texas Ranger, a handle on the internet, but Ranger Jake says, I love taking guests to Kruger, and not once have I not gotten a wow reaction from my guest in terms of the vastness of Kruger. I think it's important. People understand just how big it is. And I think you've mentioned that several times, just what a massive size we're talking about. It's such a huge challenge.
The place is iconic in every sense of the word. And the fact that at one stage it was sort of under siege, the fact that it's living through its worst crisis in its century of existence, that is why we're here. That should keep us motivated, and that's the support we need. And it's a mega task that requires mega resources and serious management attention. And I can honestly say that attention was given by our leadership. Talk about top management buy-in, Chris. We have top management buy-in. And even in our country, the national strategy that I was an integral part of, I always jokingly say, we wrote it under the bush somewhere in Kruger. We started there. It's not that there's not political will. It's a country with stretched resources and here and there capacity that has not been developed. And that we can maybe fault. But it's not as if there's not the will to do this and the will to protect our Kruger and our wildlife. It's well understood. And then also a small thing. One was never under pressure not to take harsh steps. Or, more importantly, to cook the books, the figures. Those figures, I also often say to some of my friends, the numbers you get is real. I was part of it for 7 years. Just as an aside also, one must be careful when times are dark, friends are few, and easily people get despondent and say you cannot do it anyhow, and it's only corruption. Yes, there is corruption. Of course, it's corruption. But it's not as if one were not allowed to make the difference and push on.
Now, a few more things in the comments, but before I get to those, I'm going to do the comments first, and then I want to, shift to a slightly different topic. So the Strandloper 02 said last year it was I saw elephant herds of 1,000 plus in the Caprivi. Wow. I've seen big elephant herds, but I've never seen 1,000. And I've actually flown over the Okavango with the Botswana Defense Force in a Huey helicopter for 3.5 hours, which is amazing. I was actually glad when we landed because I didn't know I could fly for 3.5 hours on a fuel load like that. So I was getting a little concerned about how many pounds of fuel we had left on that aircraft when we finally landed. But I've never seen 1,000. That's amazing. 1,000 elephants, something else. And then Gareth is saying that I'm in the UK and this is starting to make me homesick. Well, along those lines, listen to the general talk about the things that he's been involved in, and I've always been a conservationist. Now I want to get involved. I want to play a role. I want to lead the effort. I'm feeling left out. But what I want to shift to, sir, very quickly is that the Peace Park Foundation is founded by South Africans, but it works around the continent, and it is supported by a number of big donors, including Agence Française de Développement, that's the French Development Agency. Anglo-American is a supporter, the Botswana Department of Wildlife and National Parks. From the U.S., the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, who provide INCL funding. I've worked with them a lot. Cartier, the list goes on and on. What a large number of, and of course the German Deutsche Gesellschaft für internationale Zusammenarbeit, GIZ. It's quite an impressive list of those who contribute to the organization. Does this help out the Peace Parks Foundation in its mission, being able to rely on so many donors?
In a big way. Chris. For the last 3, 4, 5 years, I joined them on one of the fundraising campaigns, Europe and the US. What you didn't list was the People's Postcode Lottery. Mm-hmm. In the Netherlands and in the UK, millions of South African rand coming from there. They, by the way, bought 2 of our mobile radars. That is about 10 million ZAR. The late Dr. Rupert said, allegedly, and he's quoted and it's written up in books, that without money, conservation becomes conversation. And that's unfortunately true. The resources required to secure this last cache of natural assets for the world, for the enjoyment of the world, at the pleasure of the world, but also as a duty, as a citizen of the world, it is along the lines of huge amount of monies that are required. And the peace parks are credible. the projects that they do up for scrutiny. I manage a number of projects with them, some of them with US grants, and they produce, and that is why they get more money. And it remains important. Unfortunately, there's always a little problem of money. And in the conservation world, it's very applicable. And in our country, you can easily say, South Africa, comparatively on Africa, you're rather rich. Why don't you pay for this? No country in the world, I think, will be able to take from its fiscus the amounts of money required for the Rhino campaign and for wildlife crime in our country. I can speak for our country now, and probably elsewhere as well. The world as a rhino, because South Africa has seen to it that the world as a rhino. So it's our rhino, and I unashamedly go around the world to mobilize resources for this cause.
Yeah, and I would have to say the sad tragedy of this is that Africa has lost one of its rhino species because it wasn't protected well enough, and that's really sad. We won't get them back. Yeah. So there's Gus said that I had a lodge 50 meters from the Snyman fence for 5 years. Best game watching over the Crocodile River from your stoop. And in fact, Ranger Jake says, yes, Chris, I've been guiding since 2006, but I grew up around Kruger. So in fact, Ranger Jakes is a ranger. So that's good to discover.
Great stuff.
Okay. Well, sir, listen, it's been fascinating having you on here. I don't want to cut you off, but I'm sure you have other things to get to. We actually just reached a peak in viewers. This always happens with my streams. We go along, and then as we get ready to close out, people suddenly start coming in. So I don't know what the secret there is. I'm going to have to pull them into the stream sooner. But what I would like to do is just get your thoughts. You've had a long life of service. You've contributed immensely to your nation and also to conservation. It has to have been a thrilling ride thus far, and you're not even close to letting up. You're deeply involved in this. So some thoughts about your life, your career challenges, and maybe just some advice for people, because you have a very positive outlook on things, and great leaders and their positivity can be infectious. And we really need infectious, not COVID-19 infectious, but we need infectious optimism is what we need around the world right now. So some thoughts about that.
Chris, leaders are merchants of hope, first of all. And hope is not stupid or naive. It's a bit naive. But then Covey wrote a lovely book about life, the 4 L's, which I live by. He says life is to live, to love, to learn, and to leave a legacy. To live, first of all, one must do things. Even if today you only discover a new shortcut on your computer, you've done something, or you've helped somebody. To love yourself, people, nature, other people, different people, adversaries. To learn, to every day learn. You become illiterate so soon in this world. It's just not true, and that's why I enjoy mixing and working with young people. And then to leave a legacy when you're my age, when you're going for the 7 decades, one must be serious about that and not try and outlive yourself or have monuments done or so. You will know. Like I said earlier, when your appointment is ratified in a leader in the House of your subordinates, you will know whether you made a difference or whether it was artificial or ticking the box. And I'm just privileged, Elton John has a lovely song that he says, never takes more from life than you give. Now, that guides me. One wouldn't like to be in the driver's seat all along. Younger people must do that, but to support and to pursue this and to do the rhino thing and to be involved in conservation, hugely satisfying, great privilege, and only too thankful to be part of it. And thank you for the opportunity and everybody supporting this.
Well, sir, I have to say that several comments have come in, people saying, I have to get you back for another discussion. You're welcome to come back on my channel at any time if you'd like, and we can talk offline if you're interested or you have the opportunity to come back. But people want you to come back. They're saying very nice things. So we could talk about it. And we've just reached a peak of viewers because we get ready to close. I just love this. It always happens. But anyway, so I invite you back if you're able to come back, and we'll discuss things further on these topics. But anyway, I want to thank you for your time. And I want to say to you that I know you're a humble man. It's come through quite clearly in our conversation. you're very careful to make sure that credit is given where it's given for others, where it's deserved, and not to take all the credit for things. But as Kurt Darren says, yes, and legend. Okay, that's what I'll say about you. You're a legend.
Thank you very much. Much appreciated. It doesn't make me feel important, but it makes me feel good, and feel good is okay on a Saturday night.
Well, and also I think that it shows that people recognize that you're a good person. You've done great things. So, sir, with that, I want to thank you for your time. If I could ask you to drop off, I'll give you a call back shortly, and I'm going to close out my stream here for folks on the channel, and I'll call you back shortly, okay?
Thank you, guys. All the best.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been listening to Chris Wyatt Africa with my special guest today on the Saturday live stream, retired Major General Johan Jooste, who served in the South African Defense Force, the South African National Defense, that force, the reorganized military after the end of apartheid. Retired as a 2-star general, later worked for BAE Systems, traveled the world as a defense contractor, seeing all kinds of amazing places, and then went into the employ of the South African National Park Service, where he worked for several years, and now working for the Peace Park Foundation and making hopefully a great difference in conservation in Africa. I appreciate those tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this stream. Please leave comments. You're welcome to leave it. If you've never watched the channel before, I ask you to consider becoming a subscriber just by smashing that subscription button right down there. It costs absolutely nothing to be a subscriber. And if you don't want notifications, you don't have to get them. But I recommend that you toggle that bell icon so you get notified of my future live streams and my prepared videos. And then also, feel free to leave comments. I try to read all comments, and where appropriate, I'll respond. And at a minimum, I'll like it. And then also, I ask that you smash the like button for this video, please. Please push that little like button. I thought it was a fantastic discussion. Johan Jooste was a fascinating guest, and we had so much to share. And I really appreciate those who've tuned in and watched it and stuck with it. And please share this with friends on Facebook, on social media. Paste the link, let people know about it so they come back and watch this fascinating discussion. And I want to thank you guys for that so much on this Saturday. I will go back on later today with a Stray Voltage live stream, and I'll talk about my interview with General Jooste, and then I'll also talk about the news of the day that's going on. And I'll also be highlighting upcoming streams on Chris Wyatt Africa. So for those who don't know, I've posted this, but let me just cover this very quickly. With some of the upcoming video or the live streams taking place here soon. Oh, what's that? What's that? We just got a, hang on. What's that? Oh, that's the wrong thing. It looks like we got a super chat from Bosch Zebra. Well, thank you so much for that. Oh, it's gone now. Sorry about that. Bosch Zebra gave a 14 Rand super chat. Thank you so much for that. And folks are saying congratulations on the 4th of July. Thank you so much. Just to remind folks, today is the 244th anniversary of the United States Declaration of Independence on the 4th of July, 1776, by the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, and demanding or declaring our independence from the United Kingdom. Quite a while ago, folks. Yeah, so Marius Krukam says, thanks for the awesome stream. Learned a lot. I learned quite a bit, too. I really enjoyed it. Morton says, Leka. Yeah, so let me get back to what some upcoming streams, just so you know about. Please share these with folks because we've got some really cool guests coming up. So on Monday, I have Dax, who is a Swati / Ndebele South African. His mother's from Bulawayo, his father's from South Africa, grew up in Johannesburg. He was a panel beater for many years, but had a talent for art and started painting, and now is a painter. We're going to talk about his experiences as a painter, the challenges of lockdown, what has happened to his business, and how things are going. And then on Tuesday, I will have Marlaise, who's from the famous viral video where she was riding her bicycle and ran into a rugby goalpost. And her mother caught that on video. And she became a minor celebrity out of the gate because of that. She's currently in the Netherlands where she's an au pair. We'll have her on Tuesday, but I have not set the time for that yet. Waiting to confirm it. And on Wednesday, right here on Chris Wyatt Africa, ladies and gentlemen, on Wednesday, Nadine Hofeld. That's right, Nadine, the top-performing South African Afrikaans musician who is well-known across Europe and is huge in South Africa as well, performed with the likes of Billy Ocean, the Spice Girls, Robbie Williams, and who else? Celine Dion, as well as Steve Hofmeyer in South Africa. Nadine, a part of the Corona concert series, brilliant musician. She will be on this channel right here on Chris Wyatt Africa. Can you pick up that I'm excited? I got to be careful not to be a fanboy when I interview her because I'm very excited about it. She'll be on the channel Wednesday. And that will be at 5 p.m. in South Africa and in Botswana, 11 o'clock Eastern Standard Time here in the U.S. Nadine right here on this channel. And then again on Friday, Giselle will be back carrying the theme of musicians on the channel. Giselle will be back on Friday. We'll be on for about an hour and a half, 90 minutes, talking about the release of all of her singles from the album Fit Ons Mensa, which are now available on all digital platforms. We're going to cover that, and I'll interview Giselle. We'll talk about the music, the inspiration, how she wrote this, why she came up with this song, that sort of thing. And so that is on Friday. And that's the upcoming streams here on the channel, folks. Very excited about things coming up, and I hope you are as well. And yeah, so you'll notice that on my channel, it's not simply a channel about politics. It's a channel about geostrategic issues, but also recognizing the impact of lockdown on people's mental health, their welfare around the world. I've tried to focus on bringing interesting things for everybody. So hence you've seen artists, you've seen folks who support their own culture like Kruger, Abor Maisi. We've also had, of course, now the general on here talking about conservation. I've talked about debt in Africa with my guest, as well as counterterrorism, national security in the Lake Chad Basin. The list goes on and on. Trade with Africa with Toyin Usemere was on my channel. And so I'm trying to keep a diverse channel with lots of things. If you have topics or you have a guest that you would like to see on Chris Wyatt Africa, I ask that you share it with me. You can post it in the comments, or you can go to the About tab on the channel. And under the About tab, the instructions are there. If you can't find them in the community channel, just go to the About tab and go down below the description of the channel. You'll see a little box where you check it to reveal my email address. Send me an email if you have a guest in mind. General Jooste was a guest today because one of my contacts on LinkedIn suggested that I bring him on to the channel. And I thought that was a great idea. I was already connected to him for some time on LinkedIn. And so I sent a message and he was happy to come on. And I think he was a brilliant guest. I'm really glad he was able to come on today. And we got a lot done there. Oh my goodness. Happy 4th. Look at that. Okay. So let me do this very quickly here. I want to make sure that this appears on the screen. So, all right, I'm going to zoom over there a little bit there, make myself a little bit smaller, bring the Mahalisburg back. Speaking of conservation, let me conserve some of my screen space by reducing my size because I'm quite large there at the moment. Anyway, so those are some of the upcoming things I'm trying. And look at that. Tom has donated $20 through a super chat. Oh my goodness. Thank you so much, Tom. That has to be one of the largest super chats we've had on the channel so far. Thank you. I know it is. It's one of the top 3 chats so far. Thank you so much for that, Tom. Really appreciate it. Happy 4th to you, my fellow veteran and service member. Appreciate your service to our great nation. Thank you so much. Anyway, so if you've got recommendations for who to bring on the channel, please do so. I have brought guests on the channel because people have asked for it. Big Daddy Liberty, you asked for it, you got it. I brought him on the channel. It took a while, but we got him on. Unati Kwaza, you guys suggested her. We brought her on the channel. And I've now brought the general on, and there's a few other folks that people suggested I'm trying to get on here. So please get them on. And again, yeah, Heinrich says, yes, mental health, this lockdown is having an extreme effect on the mental health of some of the ANC members. All right, so Christoph says, I have exciting guests that I'll recommend email. Well, thank you so much for that. Acid says, Big Daddy Liberty again. Yes, I would like to get Big Daddy Liberty on again, but I'm also going to try to start cycling through some of my other guests that have been on here, and I've yet to get Jeremy Nell on as my formal guest. He did call in one night on my Stray Voltage, and it was a fascinating discussion, but I want to bring him on as a formal guest, and so I'm still working that. But anyway, folks, thank you so much for tuning in to Indaba Africa, and thank you for being subscribers and or members of the channel. I'm very grateful for that, and I hope you appreciate it. I'm going to head out of here and take a look around in the brutal heat that is the 4th of July, as is the norm in this time of the year, this part of the world, and celebrate a little bit of the 4th of July, America's Independence Day, and kind of stick it to the insurrectionists who seek to destroy this wonderful country. So, folks, thank you so much for that. Tom, thank you for that super chat. Really appreciate it. It's very kind of you. Happy 4th to you. I hope you're having a good barbecue there in Tennessee. Folks around the world, those in South Africa, thank you all so much for your time, for your patience, and for your patronage to Chris Wyatt Africa. Once again, I will do a Stray Voltage live stream later this afternoon, which will be evening time in South Africa, the usual time. And I look forward to chatting with folks, and we'll see how it goes when that comes up. We'll talk about events around the world today. So, ladies and gentlemen, God bless. Thank you so much. My profound thanks to Major General Johan Jooste for being part of the program today. He was an exceptional guest, and I really appreciate the insights he shared and his views on leadership and his experiences from the things he's done. So, ladies and gentlemen, this has been a Indaba Africa production once again, and I'm Chris from Central Pennsylvania. God bless. Be safe. Christoph says, how's your Portuguese? Non-existent. Obrigado. Obrigado. That's about all I can say, Christoph. So if your guest only speaks Portuguese, we might have a problem. Anyway, so until later, I'll catch you guys later on. And I'm going to go ahead and put my closeout video on here. So God bless and be safe and have a good day out there. Anyway, you guys take care and be safe.